A 5-year-old orphan standing alone on Via Toledo at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning shouldn't have been remarkable in Naples. But this child waited with purpose that made Giuseppe's driver slow the Mercedes without being told. The girl's backpack sat perfectly centered on her small shoulders, her hair still carrying evidence of rushed morning preparation, and her eyes held that particular brightness children get when they've rehearsed something important. Giuseppe had seen fear in the faces of grown men who owed him money, but he'd never seen this kind of courage that didn't understand its own impossibility. The car stopped because something in her stillness demanded it, because 45 years of reading people told him this moment mattered in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Noah had been standing on that corner since 7:15, 30 minutes before her grandmother thought she'd left for school. Her shoelaces tied in uneven loops that would come undone by lunchtime. She'd chosen this spot because she'd watched Giuseppe's car pass here every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 weeks, ever since the idea had formed in her mind like a flower pushing through concrete. The other children at Scuola Elementare Antonio Gramsci had been talking about the father-daughter dance for 2 months, their excitement building like a wave that would crash over everyone except the ones standing on shore alone. She'd tried not to listen during those conversations, tried to make herself small enough to disappear from notice, but every poster in the hallway reminded her of the empty space. Giuseppe stepped from the Mercedes wearing a coat that cost more than most families in Quartieri Spagnoli earned in 3 months, his presence commanding the street in ways that had nothing to do with clothing. He'd been running this territory since his own father's funeral 18 years ago, inheriting an empire built on respect and fear in measures that shifted. The neighborhood treated him like a force of nature, something to acknowledge and accommodate, but never directly confront, which made the sight of a child walking straight toward him genuinely surprising. His bodyguard moved to intercept, but Giuseppe raised one hand, curiosity overriding protocol for reasons he couldn't have explained in any language. The distance between them closed in seconds that felt slower, Noah's small legs covering ground with determination that came from knowing she only had one chance. She'd practiced her words in the bathroom mirror that morning, then again while walking to this corner, but now facing the man himself, her carefully prepared speech tangled. Up close he seemed even taller than he did from her grandmother's window, his face carrying lines that spoke of decisions she couldn't understand, and his eyes held something that made her remember her father before the accident. She swallowed once, then again, and felt her grandmother's words echo in her mind about courage being doing the scared thing. "Signor Giuseppe," she said with a voice that barely carried over the morning traffic but held steady despite everything. "I'm Noah, and I need to ask you something very important about the dance at school." The words came out in a rush that blurred their edges together, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles showed white. She'd been told he was dangerous, that children should cross the street when they saw him coming, but her grandmother had also mentioned once that he'd loved his own daughter, before something happened that no one talked about. That small piece of information had planted itself in Noah's mind and grown into hope that maybe, just maybe, someone who understood loss might understand her need. Giuseppe looked down at the child who'd stopped his morning routine, his expression unreadable in the way that had served him well in negotiations where showing emotion meant losing advantage. But something about her directness, the way she'd used his name without title or fear, created a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long it felt like skin. The bodyguard shifted his weight, waiting for a signal to remove this interruption, but Giuseppe remained still as stone, while traffic moved around them, and the city woke up to another day of business, both legal and otherwise. He'd been asked for many things over the years, favors and mercy and money, always by adults who understood the transactional nature of his world. "There's a father-daughter dance at my school on Friday night," Noah continued with the kind of honesty that only children possess before the world teaches them to hide their needs. "And I don't have a father anymore because of the accident last year with the truck." Her voice didn't break on the word accident, though her grip on the backpack straps tightened until the fabric creased under the pressure of small fingers. Giuseppe's driver had turned off the engine without being told, understanding somehow that they wouldn't be moving for a while, that whatever was happening on this street corner required time to unfold. Morning light caught the dust particles floating between the man and the child, creating an atmosphere that felt separate from the bustling city around them, as if this conversation existed in a pocket of space where normal rules didn't apply. "Would you be my dad for the dance?" Noah asked, with the final thread of courage she'd been saving for this exact moment. "Just for one night so I can dance like the other girls, and not sit alone watching." The question hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in its vulnerability. stripping away every layer of complexity that usually governed Giuseppe's interactions with the world. His mind filled with images he'd buried years ago, a daughter's birthday party he'd missed for business, recitals he'd skipped because territory disputes demanded attention, the gradual distance that had grown between him and the only person who'd ever called him Papa with pure love instead of calculated respect. She lived in Milan now with her mother, called twice a year on obligatory holidays, her voice polite and distant as a stranger discussing weather. The other men in Giuseppe's organization would see this moment as weakness, a crack in the foundation that could be exploited. But standing here looking at Noah's upturned face, he found he didn't care about their opinions for the first time in 18 years. Something in her request bypassed every defense mechanism he'd constructed, reaching a part of him he'd thought had died, along with his capacity for simple human connection. "I'll pick you up at 6:30 on Friday," he said, with a voice that carried none of its usual commanding tone, just the quiet certainty of a promise being made to someone who desperately needed promises kept. "Give me your address and make sure your grandmother knows I'm coming so she doesn't worry about strange men in expensive cars appearing at her door." Noah's hand trembled as she pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her backpack pocket, the address written in her grandmother's shaky handwriting with extra careful letters that spoke of failing eyesight compensated by determination. She'd prepared this detail the night before, knowing that if she got this far, she'd need to provide information quickly before the moment dissolved like sugar in rain. The paper exchanged hands, Giuseppe's fingers careful not to crush the delicate offering. His bodyguard's face betrayed shock that would become legendary in the retelling, the moment when their boss agreed to escort an orphan to a school dance instead of attending to the 16 urgent matters waiting at the office. Giuseppe folded the address into his inner coat pocket, where he kept only things that mattered, next to his mother's rosary and the single photograph of his daughter from before everything changed. The gesture wasn't lost on Noah, who'd learned to read the small signals adults gave when they meant what they said. "Thank you," she whispered, with eyes that suddenly brimmed with tears she'd been holding back since leaving her grandmother's apartment, since weeks of watching other children with their fathers, since the night her parents died, and left her in a world that felt too big and too cold. She didn't wipe the tears away, didn't apologize for them, just let them fall while maintaining eye contact in a way that forced Giuseppe to witness the impact of his choice, rather than allowing him the comfort of emotional distance. Giuseppe nodded once, the kind of gesture that sealed deals worth millions in back rooms, where handshakes meant more than contracts, then returned to his car without another word, because he'd already given more of himself in 3 minutes than he had in 3 years. The Mercedes pulled away from the curb, leaving Noah standing on Via Toledo with her backpack and her crumpled paper and a promise from the most powerful man in Quartieri Spagnoli that he would be her father for one night. The morning suddenly felt different to her. The same streets she walked every day now transformed into a place where impossible things could happen if you were brave enough to ask. She turned toward school with steps that felt lighter despite the backpack's weight, her mind already spinning with questions about what dress to wear and whether her grandmother's old perfume would be appropriate, and how to explain to the other children that yes, she would have someone to dance with after all. The posters in the hallway would mean something different now, celebration, instead of reminder of what she lacked. Inside the Mercedes, Giuseppe's driver ventured a careful question about whether they should run background checks on the child's family, standard procedure for anyone entering the boss's private life even temporarily. Giuseppe's response was a look that conveyed more than words ever could, a warning that this situation existed outside normal protocols, that applying his usual caution to a grieving child would be an insult to something he couldn't quite name but felt in his chest like a stone. His phone buzzed with messages about a shipment delayed at the port, a dispute over territory boundaries that needed immediate arbitration, a meeting with city officials who required careful management of both flattery and implicit threat. Giuseppe ignored all of it, his mind occupied instead with logistics he hadn't considered in decades, like what one wears to a school dance and whether 5-year-olds expect their fathers to know how to waltz, or if swaying in place would suffice. The bodyguard made a call to his wife, asking in hushed tones about children's events and appropriate behavior for father figures, his confusion evident in every word, because their boss had spent 18 years avoiding anything that reminded him of family. She suggested flowers for the child, maybe a corsage like the ones teenagers wore to proms, but that felt too formal for a 5-year-old who still tied her shoes in uneven loops and carried a backpack decorated with cartoon characters. Back at Noah's school, she slipped into her classroom 3 minutes late, earning a gentle reminder from her teacher about punctuality that barely registered because her heart was still racing from the encounter. She took her seat next to the window where she could see Via Toledo in the distance, the spot where her life had just changed in ways she couldn't fully comprehend, but felt deeply in the way children understand important things before they have words for them. Her classmate Maria leaned over to whisper about the dance, asking again if Noah had anyone to take her, or if she'd be sitting with the teachers like the other children without fathers. The question would have hurt yesterday, would have sent Noah retreating into herself the way she'd learned to do when reality pressed too hard. But today she simply smiled and said yes, she had someone, and watched Maria's face shift from pity to genuine happiness. At Giuseppe's office in a building that looked like a legitimate import business but served functions the tax authorities would find interesting, his second-in-command waited with a folder of urgent decisions that couldn't be delayed another day. Giuseppe walked past him to his private office, poured a drink he didn't plan to consume, and stood at the window overlooking the port where his family's empire had begun 3 generations ago, with his grandfather's first strategic friendship with a customs official. He'd inherited not just territory and income streams, but a reputation built on being harder than circumstances, colder than necessary, more calculating than human connection allowed. His father had taught him that sentiment was weakness in their world, that emotional attachments became leverage for enemies, that a man in their position lived alone at the top by choice rather than circumstance. Those lessons had served him well until this morning, when a child with uneven shoelaces had somehow bypassed 18 years of careful emotional architecture with one simple request. The drink sat untouched on his desk, while Giuseppe considered calling his daughter in Milan, trying to bridge a gap that had grown from months into years of polite distance. His hand reached for the phone 3 times, and retreated 3 times, because he didn't know what he'd say after hello, didn't know how to explain that he'd agreed to be a father to a stranger's child for one night, when he'd failed so completely at being a father to his own. His second-in-command finally knocked, entered without waiting for permission the way trusted lieutenants could, and asked if everything was all right, because the port situation really did require immediate attention. Giuseppe turned from the window with the expression that had ended arguments and lives in equal measure, but his voice when he spoke carried something his associate had never heard before, a thread of something almost like vulnerability woven through the usual command. "Clear my schedule. Friday evening," Giuseppe said without elaboration or explanation, knowing that would generate speculation throughout the organization, but not caring because some decisions existed outside the normal hierarchies of power and obligation. His second-in-command nodded slowly, recognizing the tone of a man who'd made a choice that couldn't be questioned, even if it made no tactical sense, even if it exposed him in ways their world punished mercilessly. The afternoon passed in a blur of business as usual, Giuseppe handling the port dispute with his characteristic efficiency, and the territorial negotiation with just enough implied threat to achieve desired outcomes without actual violence. But underneath the familiar rhythms of his day ran a current of anticipation he hadn't felt in years, a sense that Friday evening represented something more significant than a simple good deed, though he couldn't articulate exactly what that something might be. In her grandmother's small apartment in the heart of Quartieri Spagnoli, Noah burst through the door with news that tumbled out in a breathless rush, while her grandmother sat at the kitchen table sorting her diabetes medication into daily containers with hands that shook from the effort. The old woman's face cycled through disbelief, concern, and finally a smile that cracked through the worry lines she'd worn since the accident that took her son and daughter-in-law and left her responsible for a child when she could barely manage herself. "You asked the Giuseppe," her grandmother repeated slowly as if saying the words might make them less impossible, "the man that even the police step carefully around. And he said yes to taking my granddaughter to a school dance." She laughed then, a sound that held both joy and something like wonder, because in all her 73 years, she'd never heard of the neighborhood's most feared figure doing something so tenderly ordinary as attending a children's event. Wednesday morning arrived with Giuseppe doing something he hadn't done in 18 years, calling a boutique that specialized in children's formal wear and asking questions that revealed his complete ignorance of what 5-year-old girls wore to dances. The shop owner recognized his voice immediately, the kind of recognition that came with both excitement at landing such a client and nervousness about what refusal might cost. Though Giuseppe's requests were so unexpectedly innocent, they generated confusion rather than fear. He described Noah without using her name, mentioning the backpack and the uneven shoelaces and the way she'd stood on Via Toledo, like she owned the morning despite being small enough to disappear in a crowd. The boutique owner suggested a dress in pale blue with white ribbons, something age-appropriate but special enough for a child who needed to feel like the occasion mattered. And Giuseppe agreed without asking the price because some things existed outside financial calculation. The same afternoon found Noah and her grandmother on a bus to the market district, the old woman having saved coins in a jar for months, without knowing specifically what they'd be used for, but trusting that eventually her granddaughter would need something special. They walked past stalls selling everything from fresh mozzarella to bootleg designer handbags, Noah's hand tight in her grandmother's, as they navigated crowds that parted slightly when they recognized the child. Everyone in the neighborhood knew had lost everything in one terrible moment. The dress shop they finally entered was modest compared to the boutique Giuseppe had called, but the owner greeted them with warmth that had nothing to do with potential profit, and everything to do with knowing this child's story, the way everyone in Quartieri Spagnoli knew everyone else's business. She brought out 3 dresses in Noah's size, each one carefully selected to make a little girl feel beautiful, without the price tag that would insult her grandmother's carefully saved coins. Noah chose white with small flowers embroidered along the hem, not because it was the fanciest option, but because her mother had worn flowers in her hair on special occasions, and the connection felt important even if she couldn't explain why. Her grandmother nodded approval, paid with bills and coins that represented skipped meals and extra hours of careful budgeting, and carried the wrapped dress home like it contained something more precious than fabric and thread. Giuseppe's preparation involved different logistics, a haircut from the barber who'd been trimming the family's hair for 3 generations, and questions about appropriate behavior at children's events that made the old man laugh until tears ran down his weathered face. No one had ever seen their neighborhood's most powerful figure genuinely uncertain about anything, but here, he sat, asking if he should bring flowers, and what kind of shoes worked for dancing with someone who barely reached his waist when standing on tiptoes. Thursday evening, Giuseppe found himself in his closet considering suits that cost more than wedding gowns, trying to determine which would seem least intimidating to a 5-year-old and her elderly grandmother when he appeared at their door. He settled on charcoal gray instead of his usual black, no tie because formality had limits even in his world, and shoes that were expensive but not ostentatiously so, the kind of choices that revealed how much this evening mattered, despite his attempts to treat it as just another obligation. His daughter called that night, the first non-holiday contact in 8 months, her voice carrying across the line from Milan, with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that emotional investment in her father led only to disappointment. Giuseppe almost told her about Friday's plan, almost tried to explain that he was attempting to be for a stranger what he'd failed to be for her, but the words wouldn't form because how do you apologize for years of absence in a 3-minute phone call that felt like a business transaction? They talked instead about surface things, her job at the design firm and his health and the weather in their respective cities, a conversation that could have happened between polite acquaintances rather than father and daughter. When she hung up, Giuseppe sat in his study with his untouched drink and the dress box from the boutique sitting on his desk like evidence of some crime he couldn't name, wondering if doing right by one child could somehow atone for failing another. Noah spent Thursday night practicing dance steps in her grandmother's tiny living room, the old woman humming melodies from her own childhood, while her granddaughter twirled and stumbled and laughed in ways she hadn't since before the accident. The white dress hung on the closet door where Noah could see it from her mattress on the floor, a constant reminder that tomorrow would bring something she'd stopped believing possible, that loneliness had an expiration date, even if just for one evening. Her grandmother braided her hair before bed, fingers working slowly through tangles with patience, born from love rather than obligation, telling stories about Noah's father at that same age, and how he'd been brave like her, willing to ask for what he needed instead of suffering in silence. The stories hurt and healed simultaneously, keeping memory alive while allowing new moments to exist alongside grief rather than being consumed by it completely. Friday morning arrived with sunshine that felt personal, as if Naples itself had decided this day required perfect weather for a dance that meant everything to one small girl, and something undefined but significant to a man who'd forgotten how to care about anything beyond power and territory. Giuseppe woke earlier than necessary, his body betraying nervousness he hadn't experienced since his first meeting with the old bosses, who'd decided whether to accept him as his father's successor or eliminate him as a threat. He showered longer than usual, shaved twice to ensure no rough stubble would scratch a child's hand during a dance, and dressed with the kind of care usually reserved for meetings where first impressions determined whether negotiations would end in agreement or violence. The corsage he'd ordered sat in his refrigerator next to expensive wine and leftover pasta, white roses small enough for a 5-year-old's wrist, chosen after consulting 3 different florists who'd each expressed confusion about his requirements. At school, Noah's teacher noticed her distraction, the way her eyes kept drifting to the clock as if she could force time to move faster through sheer willpower, and chose not to reprimand because sometimes children needed to dream about happy endings even during lessons about mathematics and grammar. Her classmates had stopped asking if she had someone for the dance, having accepted her earlier confirmation without fully believing it, because hope often requires seeing to become real. The final bell rang at 3 o'clock, releasing students into an afternoon that stretched before Noah, like a vast ocean she had to cross before reaching the shore of 6:30, when Giuseppe's Mercedes would appear at her building. She walked home slowly despite her eagerness, savoring the anticipation because she'd learned that good things were rare enough to deserve the full experience of waiting for them to arrive. Her grandmother had cleaned their small apartment until every surface gleamed, not because Giuseppe would judge them, but because pride demanded showing that poverty didn't mean lacking dignity, that their home might be humble, but it was cared for with the same attention other people gave to mansions. The white dress hung ready, shoes polished until they reflected light, and the old woman's own best outfit laid out for an occasion she wouldn't miss, even if her failing health made leaving the apartment increasingly difficult. Giuseppe left his office at 5:30, an hour earlier than the 6:30 pickup time, because he wanted to drive through Quartieri Spagnoli slowly enough to remember what these streets had been like before he'd become the man people feared, when he'd been just another kid playing soccer against crumbling walls and dreaming of futures that didn't involve choosing between family loyalty and the law. The neighborhoods looked different through the lens of this evening's mission, less like territory to control, and more like community that existed beyond his influence. He parked 3 buildings away from Noah's address at 6:25, giving himself 5 minutes to observe the building and calm the unfamiliar flutter in his chest that felt uncomfortably like anxiety, like the stakes of this evening somehow exceeded any business deal or territorial negotiation he'd ever conducted. Families were gathering on balconies to watch the sunset. Children played in the street with a soccer ball held together by tape, and life continued in the way it always did in neighborhoods where people made joy from whatever materials they had available. At exactly 6:30, Giuseppe knocked on a door that had seen better decades, his corsage box held carefully in one hand, while the other hung at his side, resisting the urge to check his phone for the messages that were undoubtedly piling up from associates who didn't understand why their boss had become unreachable for an entire evening. Noah's grandmother opened the door with eyes that assessed him in the way old women did, seeing past expensive clothes and dangerous reputation to the nervousness he thought he'd hidden, and invited him inside with a gesture that conveyed both welcome and warning about the precious cargo he'd be escorting tonight. Noah appeared in the doorway of the tiny bedroom wearing her white dress with embroidered flowers, her hair braided with ribbons her grandmother had saved from decades past, and Giuseppe felt something crack inside his chest that he'd thought was permanently sealed. She'd attempted to tie her own shoes this time with better results than Tuesday morning, though one bow was noticeably larger than the other, a detail that somehow made the entire picture more perfect. The corsage looked enormous against her small wrist when Giuseppe slipped it on with hands that had signed death warrants without trembling, but now shook slightly from the weight of this gentler responsibility. White roses matched her dress in a way he'd hoped for, but hadn't been certain would work, and Noah's gasp of delight when she saw the flowers made every confused phone call with florists worth the effort. Her grandmother watched from her chair, tissues already in hand though the evening had barely begun, her weathered face showing every one of her 73 years alongside something ageless in her smile. She'd dressed in her best outfit, despite knowing she couldn't attend, wanting to honor the occasion, by looking proper when sending her granddaughter off to an evening that had seemed impossible just days ago. Giuseppe offered Noah his hand, with the same formality he'd use greeting dignitaries, treating her like someone whose dignity mattered rather than a child to be managed, and she took it without hesitation. They walked to the Mercedes together, her small fingers wrapped around 2 of his larger ones, her steps quick to match his longer stride, and people watching from windows witnessed something they'd discussed for years. The drive to Scuola Elementare Antonio Gramsci took 7 minutes through streets Giuseppe controlled, but was seeing tonight through different eyes, as if escorting Noah transformed familiar territory into somewhere he'd never truly noticed. She sat in the back seat with her corsage carefully positioned so it wouldn't crush against the leather, her white dress spread around her like a cloud that had somehow taken solid form. She talked in that stream of consciousness way children have about her teacher and the decorations committee, and how the gymnasium would look with all the lights and flowers everyone had been preparing. Giuseppe listened without interrupting, letting her words wash over him like a language he'd forgotten he knew, the simple excitement of a child who still believed good things could happen, despite everything life had already taken from her. The leather seats of the Mercedes felt different, with Noah's small presence transforming the space from mobile office to something closer to family vehicle, and Giuseppe noticed details he'd never registered before, like how the streetlights created patterns on the ceiling or how the radio played songs he'd stopped actually hearing years ago. She asked if he liked music, and when he said yes, she requested her favorite song, something bright and silly that his driver found on a pop station. And suddenly the car filled with melody that had no place in Giuseppe's usual world of careful silence and strategic conversations. He found himself almost smiling at her off-key humming, this child who'd managed in 5 days to crack open spaces in his life he'd sealed so thoroughly he'd forgotten they existed, and the vulnerability of that realization should have terrified him but instead felt like relief from carrying weight he hadn't known was crushing him until it lightened slightly. Noah pointed out landmarks through the window with the enthusiasm of a tour guide, explaining which bakery had the best cornetti even though she could rarely afford them, and which corner her father used to buy flowers for her mother on Fridays. And Giuseppe understood these weren't just geographical markers, but emotional coordinates mapping a life lived in joy, before tragedy redrew all the boundary. She spoke about her parents without the desperate sadness that usually accompanied such references, mentioning them the way living people mention other living people they expect to see again. And he wondered if 5-year-olds understood death differently, or if Noah had simply found a way to keep them alive through constant casual inclusion in her daily narrative. The stories weren't requests for pity or attempts to manipulate emotion, just natural sharing of the people who'd shaped her world before disappearing from it, and Giuseppe envied that ability to hold grief and hope simultaneously, without letting either one completely dominate. His phone continued buzzing in his pocket, with the insistence of associates who couldn't imagine what could be more important than the crises they were managing, and each vibration represented a choice between his old life and this new present he was attempting to inhabit. Giuseppe had spent 18 years training his organization to expect immediate responses regardless of circumstances, building a reputation for being always available and always in control, and deviating from that pattern even for one evening would generate speculation and potentially weakness that rivals could exploit. But Noah was explaining about the art project she'd made at school, depicting families of different kinds, how she'd drawn her grandmother and herself, and left space for other people who might join their small constellation. And Giuseppe realized that answering his phone would teach her the same lesson he'd taught his daughter, that she wasn't actually as important as whatever business demanded at Ensign. The Mercedes slowed as they approached the school, and Noah's chatter quieted into something more subdued, nervous energy replacing her earlier enthusiasm, as the reality of walking into that gymnasium with everyone watching became more immediate than abstract. She asked Giuseppe if he thought people would stare, and he answered honestly that yes, they probably would because this situation was unusual, but that sometimes being stared at meant people were witnessing something brave rather than something wrong, and her job was just to enjoy the evening regardless of how many eyes were watching. She nodded with a seriousness that seemed too heavy for her small frame, then took a deep breath that her whole body participated in, shoulders rising and falling with the effort of gathering courage, and Giuseppe recognized that gesture because he'd made similar preparations before entering rooms, where his life might depend on projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. His phone buzzed 3 times with messages he ignored, choosing instead to focus on Noah's reflection in the rearview mirror as she practiced sitting up straight the way her grandmother had instructed. The driver knew better than to comment on the unusual passenger or the unprecedented destination, keeping his eyes forward while his boss underwent a transformation he couldn't name, but recognized as significant. They passed the church where Noah's parents' funeral had been held 13 months ago, and Giuseppe saw her go quiet for exactly 7 seconds before resuming her chatter with forced brightness. He understood that particular kind of courage, the decision to push through grief rather than let it consume the moment, and silently acknowledged her strength in the way one survivor recognizes another. The school came into view with its modest facade, lit by strings of lights someone had hung with more enthusiasm than expertise, creating an atmosphere of celebration that transcended the building's usual institutional plainness. Other Mercedes were arriving too, but Giuseppe's was the only one that made parents instinctively gather their children closer, while simultaneously craning to see who would emerge from the vehicle everyone in Quartieri Spagnoli recognized. Giuseppe's driver opened Noah's door with the same respect he'd show any VIP, and she stepped out into the evening with her hand reaching automatically for Giuseppe's, trusting that he'd be there to steady her descent. The moment her shoes touched pavement, conversations around them didn't stop exactly but shifted in quality, voices dropping to whispers that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Teachers standing at the entrance froze mid-greeting, their welcoming smiles becoming fixed as they processed the impossible sight of their neighborhood's most feared figure, escorting little Noah, whose desk sat in the third row by the window. Principal Russo came forward with a professionalism that barely masked her shock, greeting them both with words that came out slightly too formal, slightly too careful, as if one wrong syllable might shatter whatever spell had brought this pairing into existence. Noah seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps she'd simply decided that tonight she deserved to feel normal regardless of who accompanied her, and she tugged Giuseppe toward the gymnasium entrance with the confidence of a child who finally belonged. He followed her lead, this man who commanded rooms full of dangerous men with a look, allowing himself to be guided by someone who weighed less than 50 pounds and whose biggest concern was whether they'd play the song she'd been practicing to. Inside the gymnasium, decorations hung from every available surface in a riot of color that spoke to parent volunteers' determination to create magic on a limited budget, streamers and balloons and handmade banners celebrating fathers and daughters. Giuseppe took in the scene with the same careful attention he'd give any new territory, noting exits and sightlines and potential threats, before remembering that tonight, the only thing he needed to protect was one small girl's joy. Other father-daughter pairs turned to stare with varying degrees of subtlety, some fathers recognizing Giuseppe and instinctively moving their children to the opposite side of the gymnasium, others simply curious about why this elegant stranger was attracting such intense attention. Noah's classmate Maria broke free from her father's hand and ran over, squealing with delight about Noah's dress and corsage, her genuine happiness at seeing her friend included creating the first crack in the wall of tension surrounding their arrival. The music started before they'd fully entered, a cheerful pop song that had been popular during Giuseppe's own daughter's childhood, and Noah's face lit up with recognition and anticipation that made her look even younger than her 5 years. She looked up at Giuseppe with a question in her eyes, asking without words if they could join the other pairs already moving to the music, and he nodded despite having no idea how to dance to such a song. They moved to the floor together, Noah's hand in his and her other hand reaching up to rest on his arm, since his waist was too high for her to reach comfortably, and Giuseppe bent slightly to accommodate. The first steps were awkward, his movements stiff from decades of not dancing, and her movements enthusiastic, but uncoordinated. Yet somehow they found a rhythm that worked for them, even if it matched nothing the music suggested. The gymnasium's temperature had risen noticeably from the combined body heat of dozens of dancing pairs, and the inadequate ventilation system that belonged to a building constructed decades before air conditioning became standard, and Giuseppe felt sweat beginning to form at his collar in a way that would normally irritate him, but tonight simply registered as proof of physical presence. Noah seemed unbothered by the warmth, her energy apparently endless as she bounced and spun with enthusiasm that suggested she could dance for hours more if the music continued. And Giuseppe envied that capacity children had to throw themselves completely into moments without reserving energy for whatever might come next. Other fathers were visibly tiring, some sneaking glances at watches or the clock on the gymnasium wall, calculating how much longer until this obligation ended and they could return to their normal Friday evening routines. But Giuseppe discovered he wasn't counting minutes or anticipating conclusion, just existing in this strange, suspended present, where nothing beyond this dance floor mattered. Principal Russo watched from her position near the sound system with an expression that cycled between disbelief and something approaching hope, perhaps recognizing that if the neighborhood's most feared figure could show up authentically for one vulnerable child, then maybe other impossible transformations were possible too. She'd been teaching in Quartieri Spagnoli for 23 years, long enough to develop protective cynicism about human nature and realistic expectations about how much one school could actually change in students' lives when they returned each afternoon to circumstances that undermined every lesson about kindness and possibility. But tonight, she was witnessing something that challenged her careful pessimism, a moment where power chose gentleness and isolation chose connection, and she found herself hoping it would ripple outward beyond this gymnasium in ways that might prove her cynicism had been premature surrender rather than wisdom. The refreshment table had been gradually depleted throughout the evening by children who treated cookies and punch as primary motivation for attending, and volunteers rushed to replenish supplies while trying not to obviously stare at Giuseppe, who represented everything these parent volunteers usually feared about their neighborhood. They'd discussed among themselves before the dance whether his attendance was security risk or unprecedented opportunity, whether they should feel grateful for his presence or terrified by what it might mean, and consensus had been impossible, because Giuseppe existed in that complicated space where threat and protection were often indistinguishable, depending on whose perspective you occupied. But watching him now, carefully guiding Noah through steps she barely knew, while his face showed concentration usually reserved for life-or-death negotiations, the volunteers found their theoretical concerns dissolving into recognition that whatever else he was, tonight he was simply another adult trying not to disappoint a child who trusted him. Maria's mother leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made him nod thoughtfully, both of them watching Giuseppe and Noah with expressions that suggested they were recalibrating assumptions they'd held for years about who deserved grace and who deserved judgment. Their daughter had come home from school multiple times that week, talking about how Noah finally had someone for the dance, how excited she was that her friend wouldn't be left out, and the parents had privately worried about what it meant that a mafia boss was the solution to a child's loneliness, rather than some more appropriate community resource. But appropriate community resources hadn't stepped forward during the months when Noah's isolation had been obvious to anyone paying attention, and Giuseppe had, and perhaps that simple fact of showing up when others hadn't mattered more than the complicated moral calculations about whether his presence was ultimately good or dangerous for their children to witness. Other pairs gave them space without seeming to, creating an invisible circle around the feared mafia boss and the orphan girl, everyone in the gymnasium aware they were witnessing something that transcended a simple school dance. Noah twirled under Giuseppe's raised hand with her white dress spinning out around her, and for exactly that moment, she looked like every other 5-year-old girl at her first formal event, belonging completely instead of watching from the margins. The music created a pocket of time that existed separately from the clocks on the gymnasium walls, moments stretching and compressing based on emotional weight rather than actual duration, and Giuseppe found himself lost in the simple mechanics of movement and presence. He'd negotiated million-euro deals with less attention than he gave to ensuring Noah's steps landed safely, less care than he devoted to making sure her dress didn't tangle around her legs, and the inversion of his usual priorities felt both disorienting and strangely appropriate, as if this was what he should have been focusing on all along. Other dancers moved around them in patterns that occasionally brought fathers and daughters close enough for brief exchanges, small nods of acknowledgement, or careful smiles, that suggested the ice of fear was beginning to thaw into something approaching acceptance of this unprecedented situation. Noah looked up at him during a quieter section of the song and said with perfect seriousness that he was a good dancer for someone who probably didn't practice very much, and Giuseppe laughed genuinely for the second time that evening, a sound that made several nearby parents turn in surprise. She asked if his daughter had liked dancing with him when she was small, and the question landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of regret that spread through Giuseppe's chest. But he answered truthfully that he didn't know because he'd never actually danced with her at events like this, had always been too busy with work that seemed urgent until this moment when he understood it had mostly been escape from intimacy disguised as responsibility. Noah processed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance children have before they learn that adult failures require careful management, then patted his arm in a gesture clearly meant as comfort, and said that maybe he could dance with her next time if she visited, as if Giuseppe's broken relationship with his daughter was a simple problem solved through future planning rather than years of accumulated damage. The song transitioned into something faster, and several fathers took the opportunity to rest, leading their daughters to the refreshment table, or simply standing at the edge of the dance floor to recover their breath and dignity. Giuseppe considered joining the exodus, but Noah's grip on his hand tightened with a silent plea to continue, and he understood that for her, each song represented precious time that had been unimaginable days ago, and would end too soon, regardless of how many dances they shared. So they stayed on the floor through the upbeat chaos while other pairs rotated in and out, and Giuseppe discovered that moving without grace or technique didn't actually matter, when the point was simply to be present for someone who needed presence more than perfection. Maria's father approached during a brief pause between songs, and introduced himself formally as Domenico, extending his hand in a gesture that acknowledged Giuseppe's status, while also claiming equal ground as another father attending his daughter's event. The handshake was firm and brief, both men understanding they existed in different worlds that happened to overlap in this gymnasium for this one evening. And Domenico mentioned casually that his daughter had been worried Noah would have to sit alone during the dance, that Maria had been prepared to share her father if necessary, because that's what friends did for each other. The information carried weight beyond its simple delivery, suggesting that these children had been conspiring toward inclusion before Giuseppe had even received Noah's request, and he felt grateful toward this other man's daughter for the kind of friendship that noticed loneliness and tried to solve it rather than simply feeling sorry from a safe distance. Giuseppe's mind flashed to his daughter at this age, birthday parties he'd missed and school events he'd skipped, all the moments he'd sacrificed for business that had seemed so important then, but now felt like choices he'd give anything to unmake. Dancing with Noah couldn't erase those failures, couldn't bridge the years of distance with his own child, but perhaps it could prove he still possessed the capacity for this kind of simple presence, if circumstances ever allowed him another chance. The song ended and another began, this one slower and more traditional, the kind of waltz that required actual steps, rather than just swaying and spinning. And Giuseppe saw panic flash across Noah's face as other fathers lifted their daughters onto their feet to dance properly. He solved the problem without discussion by lifting her up so her feet rested on his shoes, her white dress cascading down while he moved them both in the basic box step his own father had taught him before everything became complicated. From this elevated position, Noah could see the entire gymnasium, all the other girls dancing with their fathers, and her smile grew so wide it looked almost painful in its intensity, as if joy could be a physical force pressing against the boundaries of her small face. She waved at Maria, whose father waved back with less suspicion than he'd shown earlier, the simple act of dancing together making Giuseppe seem less like a threat, and more like just another father navigating the strange territory of school events. Principal Russo watched from the refreshment table with a cup of punch she'd forgotten she was holding, her mind trying to reconcile 18 years of neighborhood knowledge about Giuseppe with the image of him carefully guiding a child around the dance floor. She'd taught in Quartieri Spagnoli long enough to know that people were complicated, that the same man who controlled illegal activities could also genuinely care about one orphaned girl, but witnessing the contradiction still felt like seeing two incompatible realities occupy the same space. The gymnasium's modest decorations created shadows and light that moved across the dancing pairs, transforming the utilitarian space into somewhere that felt separate from ordinary life, a pocket dimension where normal rules about who could connect with whom didn't apply. Giuseppe found himself relaxing into the rhythm, his movements becoming less mechanical and more natural, and Noah responded by resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture of trust that pierced through every defense he'd constructed over 45 years. Other fathers began approaching during the break between songs, men who recognized Giuseppe and needed to acknowledge his presence even here, even now, because ignoring him would be its own kind of statement. They kept their greetings brief and respectful, not mentioning business or territory, focusing instead on awkward compliments about Noah's dress or comments about the surprisingly good decorations, conversations that existed on the surface of much deeper currents. Giuseppe handled each interaction with the same careful courtesy, making it clear through tone and brevity that tonight he wasn't here as who he usually was, that this evening existed outside his normal operations and should be treated as such. The fathers understood, retreating after their brief acknowledgments, and slowly the gymnasium's atmosphere shifted from tense awareness to something approaching acceptance of this strange situation. Noah asked if they could get punch during the next break, her voice small but hopeful, and Giuseppe realized she'd been watching other pairs visit the refreshment table but hadn't wanted to impose on his time. They walked over together, still hand in hand, and she carefully selected a cookie from the assortment while he poured 2 cups of punch that tasted like artificial fruit and childhood memories he'd thought were completely buried. A mother approached with her daughter, one of Noah's classmates, and congratulated them both on how beautiful they looked dancing, her voice carrying genuine warmth that had nothing to do with fear or calculation. She asked Noah about her dress, and listened to the answer with real attention, treating this moment as simply what it appeared to be, rather than the complicated intersection of circumstances that had actually brought it into existence. Giuseppe watched Noah interact with her classmate and the other girl's mother, seeing her relax into social interaction in a way that suggested this kind of normal inclusion was rare enough to be precious, and he understood suddenly what his presence here actually meant. It wasn't just about giving her one night of dancing, it was about proving she deserved to be here the same as everyone else, that her orphan status didn't automatically exclude her from the experiences other children took for granted. The music shifted again to something upbeat and chaotic, clearly chosen by someone who understood that 5-year-olds had limited attention spans for slow dancing, and the gymnasium erupted into movement that bore little resemblance to actual dancing. Noah abandoned her punch cup and pulled Giuseppe back to the floor, where they joined the joyful chaos of children spinning and jumping and laughing, while their fathers tried valiantly to keep up with energy levels that defied adult comprehension. Giuseppe found himself actually laughing, a sound so unexpected that his own ears barely recognized it, as Noah demonstrated a dance move she'd apparently learned from a cartoon that involved hopping on one foot while waving both arms. Other children nearby copied her move, creating a small epidemic of ridiculous hopping that spread across their section of the gymnasium, and for 5 perfect minutes, Giuseppe existed outside his normal life entirely. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, probably his second-in-command with an urgent matter that couldn't wait until tomorrow. But Giuseppe didn't even check to see who was calling, because whatever crisis demanded his attention simply couldn't be more important than this moment. The decision felt revolutionary, choosing presence over power, choosing this child's joy over his empire's immediate needs, and he suspected there would be consequences for such neglect, but discovered he genuinely didn't care. Maria's father caught Giuseppe's eye across the dancing crowd, and nodded with something like respect, perhaps recognizing the effort it took to show up this fully for a child who wasn't biologically his, or perhaps simply acknowledging that they were both fathers trying their best in a complicated world. Giuseppe nodded back, the gesture brief but carrying weight, a moment of understanding between men who likely had nothing else in common beyond loving children who needed them. The teacher in charge of music announced that the next song would be the last dance of the evening, specifically designated for fathers and daughters to share something special, and Noah's hand tightened in Giuseppe's, as if she was afraid this magical evening might end before she was ready. He squeezed back gently, a silent promise that he'd stay until the very last note, that he wouldn't disappear before this gift was completely given. The final song began, something slow and sweet that he didn't recognize but that seemed designed specifically to make parents cry, and Giuseppe lifted Noah onto his shoes again for one last waltz around the gymnasium floor. She was heavier now than she'd been at the beginning of the evening, or perhaps he was just more aware of her weight, the physical reality of this small person who'd somehow become temporarily his, to protect and celebrate. They moved in slow circles while other pairs did the same, the gymnasium full of fathers and daughters in various configurations of family, and Giuseppe thought about all the definitions of father he'd encountered throughout his life. There was biological father, which he'd been, and apparently failed at given his daughter's distance. And there was the father role that had nothing to do with blood, but everything to do with showing up when needed. Noah whispered thank you again, her breath warm against his shoulder where her head rested, and Giuseppe felt tears threaten for the first time in 18 years, since his own father's funeral when he'd cried alone in the bathroom, before emerging to accept condolences and command. He blinked them back through sheer force of will, refusing to break down in a gymnasium full of witnesses, but the emotion itself remained, sitting heavy in his chest like something both painful and necessary. The song ended, the lights came up slightly, and Principal Russo thanked everyone for coming while reminding them to drive safely home, her voice carrying the gentle exhaustion of someone who'd spent 3 hours managing an event that had exceeded expectations. Parents began gathering belongings and tired children, the gymnasium slowly emptying of the magic that had filled it for one evening, reality reasserting itself as it always did when special occasions ended. Giuseppe and Noah were among the last to leave, her because she wanted to savor every remaining second of belonging, and him because he understood that impulse better than he would have predicted. They walked to the Mercedes through a parking lot now mostly empty, her hand still in his, and her corsage slightly wilted but still beautiful, her white dress showing signs of the evening's activities, but her face glowing with satisfaction that transcended any physical exhaustion. The drive back to her grandmother's apartment felt different than the drive to the school, weighted with the knowledge that this temporary arrangement was ending, that tomorrow Giuseppe would return to being the feared neighborhood boss, and Noah would return to being the orphan girl everyone pitied. Neither of them spoke during those 7 minutes, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable, just contemplative, both of them processing what the evening had meant beyond its surface simplicity. Her grandmother waited at the window despite the hour and her failing health, having watched from that perch for the past 3 hours, imagining how the evening was unfolding, and her face when they entered showed relief and joy and gratitude that needed no words. Giuseppe carried Noah up the stairs to the apartment because she'd fallen asleep in the car, her head resting against his shoulder and her breathing deep, and even with the particular peacefulness of a child who'd gotten exactly what she needed. He laid her on her mattress, still wearing her white dress because waking her to change seemed cruel when she'd clearly earned this rest, and her grandmother covered her with a thin blanket while tears streamed down weathered cheeks that had seen too much loss and not enough joy. Giuseppe stood in the doorway watching them, grandmother and granddaughter in their tiny apartment, and felt the full weight of the privilege he'd been given to be part of this child's life for one evening. The old woman walked him to the door with shuffling steps that spoke to her diabetes and her age, but her grip on his hand was surprisingly strong when she took it in both of hers and spoke in a whisper designed not to wake Noah. "You gave her something tonight that no amount of money could buy," she said, with eyes that saw past his reputation to something she seemed to believe existed underneath. The memory of feeling like she belongs somewhere, like she's worthy of celebration and attention and love. Giuseppe nodded because words felt inadequate for what he was experiencing. This strange mixture of grief for his own failures and gratitude for being allowed to do better for someone else's child, even if only temporarily. He descended the stairs alone, emerged into the Quartieri Spagnoli night, and sat in his Mercedes for 7 minutes before signaling his driver to start the engine, because he needed that time to transition back into himself. His phone showed 47 missed messages when he finally checked it, a mixture of business emergencies and routine matters that his organization had assumed were more important than wherever he'd been, and he felt nothing but indifference toward all of them. Whatever territory disputes or financial complications demanded attention could wait until tomorrow, until he'd had time to process what had happened tonight in that gymnasium decorated with streamers and hope. The drive to his own apartment took him through the same neighborhoods he'd controlled for 18 years, but tonight they looked different, populated by families and children, and lives that existed outside his influence, people who had problems and joys that had nothing to do with his empire. He'd always known this intellectually, but had never felt it viscerally until tonight when he'd stepped outside his role and discovered that other kinds of significance existed beyond power and fear. His apartment felt empty in a way it never had before, all 8 rooms of expensive furniture and original art suddenly seeming like stage dressing for a performance he'd been giving for decades without realizing it was a performance. He poured the drink he always poured after important evenings, but this time he actually consumed it, needing the burn of alcohol to ground him in physical sensation when his emotions felt too large to contain. His daughter's photo sat on the shelf where it had been for 13 years, frozen at age 7 before everything fell apart, and Giuseppe picked it up with hands that were steadier than they'd been holding Noah's corsage. He'd failed this child in every way that mattered, prioritized empire over relationship, chosen power over presence, and now she lived 800 miles away with polite distance and twice-yearly phone calls as the only connection remaining. The photo went back on the shelf, and Giuseppe stood at his window overlooking Naples, the city lights spreading out in all directions like stars that had fallen to earth and decided to stay, and he made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. Tomorrow he would call his daughter not for a holiday or obligation, but just to talk, to attempt to bridge a gap that might be too wide to cross, but that he'd never actually tried to bridge with genuine effort. Tonight had proven he still possessed the capacity for this kind of presence, for showing up fully for someone who needed him, even when it was inconvenient or complicated, or outside his comfort zone. And if he could do it for a stranger's child, perhaps he could learn to do it for his own. The possibility felt fragile as the white roses he'd given Noah, likely to wither and die if not carefully tended, but it existed, and that was more than he'd had this morning. His second-in-command called at 11:30, demanding to know where he'd been for 4 hours during a territorial crisis that had apparently resolved itself without his intervention. And Giuseppe's answer was simply that he'd been at a school dance fulfilling a promise to a child. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes about how unprecedented this explanation was, how completely it deviated from 18 years of established priorities and behavior patterns. The conversation ended without Giuseppe explaining further, because some experiences couldn't be translated into language his associates would understand, couldn't be reduced to tactical decisions or strategic positioning, existed in a realm of human connection that his world typically rejected as weakness. He'd given one orphaned girl an evening of belonging, and in the process had discovered that he'd been orphaned too, cut off from his own capacity for simple human warmth by choices he'd made so long ago they felt inevitable rather than chosen. Sleep came eventually, despite his mind's resistance, and Giuseppe dreamed of gymnasiums decorated with streamers and children dancing on their father's shoes, dreams that blurred Noah's face with his daughter's face until he couldn't tell them apart. until they became one child representing every moment of fatherhood he'd missed, and every moment he might still salvage. The dreams weren't nightmares, but they carried weight that made him wake exhausted, carrying the knowledge that tonight had changed something fundamental that couldn't be unchanged. Saturday morning arrived with Naples sunshine streaming through expensive windows, and Giuseppe sat at his breakfast table with coffee and newspaper and the certain knowledge that he couldn't go back to being exactly who he'd been before Tuesday morning when a 5-year-old girl had stood on Via Toledo and asked the impossible. The question now wasn't whether he'd been changed, but what he would do with that change, whether he'd let it fade like Noah's corsage would fade, or whether he'd nurture it into something that could grow beyond one magical evening. His phone sat next to his coffee cup, his daughter's number programmed in contacts under a name that still read Papa's Girl despite 13 years of evidence to the contrary, and Giuseppe stared at it while his coffee grew cold. The call he needed to make terrified him more than any business negotiation or territorial confrontation ever had, because the stakes were infinitely higher, because this was about trying to recover something precious he'd broken, rather than destroying something that threatened him. At her grandmother's apartment across the neighborhood, Noah woke still wearing her white dress with the corsage wilted on her nightstand, and a memory that would sustain her through difficulties yet to come, proof that sometimes the world could be kind in unexpected ways, that loneliness had endings even when they seemed impossible. She didn't know that across Quartieri Spagnoli, a feared mafia boss was gathering courage to call his estranged daughter. Didn't know that her simple request had created ripples that would extend far beyond one evening. But perhaps someday someone would tell her that courage is contagious, and hers had infected someone who desperately needed it. Giuseppe pressed the call button at 9:15 Saturday morning, early enough that his daughter might still be having breakfast in her Milan apartment, late enough that he couldn't claim the hour made him hang up before she answered. The phone rang 4 times, and he almost disconnected on the 5th ring, almost took the coward's escape. But then her voice came through saying hello, with the careful neutrality she'd perfected over years of obligatory contact. He hadn't planned what to say beyond her name, and now that seemed like a fatal oversight, because silence stretched between Naples and Milan, carrying the weight of 13 years of distance that couldn't be crossed with small talk. His daughter waited without prompting him, perhaps assuming this was another brief check-in about health or holidays, perhaps already planning how quickly she could end the conversation and return to her Saturday morning routine that didn't include complicated feelings about an absent father. "I went to a school dance last night," Giuseppe said finally, the words tumbling out without the eloquence he'd hoped for, "with a 5-year-old girl who asked me to be her father for the evening, because hers died, and she didn't want to sit alone watching other children dance." The statement landed in the silence like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples he could almost hear across the 800 miles separating them. His daughter's breath caught audibly, a small sound that betrayed surprise breaking through her careful composure, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality than it had moments before. "You went to a children's dance," she repeated slowly, as if testing whether the words made sense in that order. "You being the man who missed every single one of mine because business always came first, and you showed up for a complete stranger's child when you couldn't show up for your own." The accusation hurt precisely because it was accurate, because Giuseppe had no defense against the truth of his failures, and he let the words hit him without deflecting or making excuses the way he might have before Friday night. "You're right," he said with a simplicity that felt revolutionary, given his lifetime of avoiding direct accountability. "I failed you completely, and I can't undo any of those missed moments. But I'm calling because that little girl made me realize I might still have time to do better if you'd be willing to let me try." His daughter was crying. He could hear it in the way her breathing changed, in the small sound she tried to suppress, and the knowledge that he'd caused these tears along with all the others throughout her childhood sat in his chest like lead. She didn't speak for what felt like hours, but was probably 90 seconds, and Giuseppe waited through the silence because rushing her would be another form of prioritizing his comfort over her needs, another repetition of the pattern he was supposedly trying to break. "Why should I believe this is different?" she finally asked, with a voice that shook from emotion held barely in check. "Why should I think one school dance with someone else's child means you've suddenly figured out how to be present, when 18 years of your own child wasn't enough motivation to change?" The question was fair and devastating, and Giuseppe had no answer that would satisfy, because she was right to doubt, right to protect herself from another round of disappointment and broken promises. "I don't know if it is different," he admitted with the kind of honesty he'd rarely practiced even in his own mind. "I only know that for 4 hours last night, I remembered what it felt like to show up for someone who needed me, and it made me realize how many times I didn't show up for you when you needed me more than this stranger's child ever could. Maybe that's not enough reason for you to give me another chance. Maybe the gap is too wide to bridge now, but I needed to call and tell you I finally understand what I threw away." His daughter's crying intensified briefly, then quieted into the kind of deep breathing people do when trying to regain control, and Giuseppe waited through this too, letting her take whatever time she needed to process what he'd said. Outside his window, Naples continued its Saturday morning routines, vendors setting up in the markets and families emerging for weekend shopping, life proceeding without pause for one man's attempt to salvage a relationship he'd spent years destroying through neglect. "I have plans today," his daughter said eventually with a tone that suggested she was retreating to safer emotional ground. "Lunch with friends and an art exhibition opening tonight. But tomorrow afternoon I'm free if you want to talk more. Really talk. Not just the surface conversation we usually have." The offer hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Permission to try for something better balanced against years of evidence that he'd waste the opportunity. Giuseppe confirmed tomorrow afternoon with a relief that surprised him in its intensity, suddenly aware that he'd been holding his breath waiting for her response, and they ended the call without the usual perfunctory expressions of affection that had felt like lies for so long. He sat with his cold coffee and his phone, and the knowledge that he'd cleared the first hurdle, but the race was far from over. That one honest conversation didn't erase 13 years of absence, no matter how sincere his intentions. Across Quartieri Spagnoli in her grandmother's apartment, Noah woke for the second time that morning and carefully removed her white dress, hanging it in the closet where she could see it every day, and remember that magic sometimes happened to girls who were brave enough to ask. Her grandmother made breakfast with shaking hands and a smile that hadn't faded since last night, talking about the dance as if it had been a wedding or graduation, an event significant enough to become part of family mythology for whatever years remained to them. The wilted corsage sat in a glass of water on the kitchen table, white roses trying valiantly to revive though their time was clearly ending, and Noah touched the petals gently while eating her breakfast. She didn't know that Giuseppe was at that exact moment trying to repair his relationship with his own daughter, didn't know that her courage on Tuesday morning had created consequences beyond her ability to imagine, but she felt different in ways she couldn't articulate even to herself. Her grandmother asked if she wanted to visit the park that afternoon, a rare offer given the old woman's health challenges, and Noah understood this was celebration continuing, acknowledgement that some moments deserved extension beyond their official endpoints. They would walk slowly through Quartieri Spagnoli together, grandmother and granddaughter, and neighbors would ask about the dance, and Noah would tell the story of Giuseppe lifting her onto his shoes so she could waltz like the other girls. The story would spread through the neighborhood the way all good stories did, growing slightly in the retelling but maintaining its essential truth, and people would discuss it in cafes and markets and building stoops for weeks afterward. Some would focus on Giuseppe's unexpected kindness, others on Noah's bravery in asking, but everyone would agree that something had shifted in their community. Some rigid boundary between fear and trust had become slightly more permeable. Sunday morning arrived with church bells calling the faithful to Mass, and Giuseppe attended for the first time in 6 years, not because he'd suddenly found religion, but because he wanted to sit in a space designed for contemplation before his afternoon conversation with his daughter. The priest recognized him despite years of absence and nodded acknowledgement without comment, understanding perhaps that some returns to faith were complicated and required space rather than interrogation. Giuseppe sat in the back pew where his family had always sat generations ago, where his grandfather and father had sat before their funerals released them from the contradictions of being both Catholic and criminal, and he prayed without words for the ability to do better. The prayers felt rusty from disuse, awkward formations of hope and regret that didn't follow any liturgical structure, but they were honest in a way his prayers hadn't been since childhood, before the world taught him that power mattered more than grace. After Mass, he walked through the neighborhood markets buying fresh produce and bread without bodyguards, for the first time in 18 years, and the vendors served him with surprise that gradually shifted to cautious friendliness. He was still Giuseppe, still commanded respect and fear in equal measure, but something in his bearing had softened just enough to allow slightly more human interaction than the pure transactional exchanges that had defined his public life for so long. His daughter called at 2 in the afternoon, exactly as promised, her voice still carrying caution but also something that might become willingness if he didn't destroy it through clumsiness or reversion to old patterns. They talked for 97 minutes about everything and nothing, childhood memories she'd held onto, and resentments she'd never fully expressed, his explanations that didn't excuse, but at least provided context for why he'd chosen empire over family so consistently. The conversation with his daughter didn't fix everything, couldn't erase years of absence with one extended phone call, but it established something that had been missing since she'd turned 13, and stopped pretending his distance didn't hurt. They agreed to talk again the following Sunday, then perhaps the Sunday after that, building a structure of consistent contact that might eventually support more substantial connection if Giuseppe could actually maintain it beyond initial enthusiasm. He told her about Noah in more detail during that call, describing the Tuesday morning encounter and the courage it took for a 5-year-old to approach someone the entire neighborhood feared, and his daughter listened without the defensiveness that had characterized her earlier responses. "Maybe helping this little girl is how you learn to help yourself," she offered quietly. "Maybe practicing presence with someone who has no history with you makes it possible to eventually be present with someone who has too much history." The insight struck Giuseppe as both generous and painful, his daughter offering him grace he hadn't earned while simultaneously acknowledging that their relationship carried scars too deep for quick healing, and he accepted both the gift and the reality without arguing. They ended the call with plans forming for a possible visit, her coming to Naples or him going to Milan, details to be determined but the intention established, and Giuseppe felt something like hope mixed with terror at the prospect of proximity after years of careful distance. Monday morning returned him to business as usual, territory meetings and financial reviews, and the 1,000 small decisions that kept his empire functioning, but he found his attention wandering in ways it never had before. His second-in-command noticed the distraction and asked carefully if everything was all right, probably expecting to hear about health concerns or external threats, clearly unprepared for Giuseppe's response that he was thinking about his daughter and wondering if he could actually be the father she deserved this late in the game. The organization adapted to this slight shift in their boss's focus the way organizations do. Some members worried it represented weakness that could be exploited. Others quietly relieved that perhaps the man who controlled their lives might be discovering he had a life beyond control. Giuseppe himself wasn't sure which interpretation was correct, only that the change felt irreversible in ways both frightening and necessary, like crossing a bridge that collapsed behind him, leaving only forward as an option. Tuesday morning, 1 week after Noah's request, found Giuseppe back in his routine, the Mercedes traveling down Via Toledo at the same time it always did, but this time he looked for her on that corner, without quite admitting to himself that he was looking. She wasn't there, of course, having no reason to stand waiting since the dance had happened and her need had been met, but part of him had hoped to see her anyway, to have evidence that Friday night had been real, and not some fever dream his isolated life had generated. His driver caught him scanning the sidewalks and said nothing, because commenting on the boss's behavior wasn't part of his job description, but Giuseppe noticed the observation, and felt something like embarrassment mixed with defiance. He didn't owe anyone explanations for why he might want to see the child who'd somehow cracked open his carefully sealed life, didn't need to justify the fact that one evening of actual human connection had left him hungry for more. The week proceeded with Giuseppe dividing his attention between his usual business and this new project of rebuilding relationship with his daughter, phone calls that grew slightly less careful and slightly more genuine with each conversation. She told him about her work at the design firm and the man she was dating who didn't know about her father's occupation, and Giuseppe listened without offering opinions or trying to control, just receiving information as the gift it was. Friday afternoon, he received a call from Principal Russo at Scuola Elementare Antonio Gramsci, her voice nervous in the way people's voices got when they needed something from him, but feared the asking. She explained that the dance committee wanted to thank him formally for attending with Noah, that his presence had meant more than he probably realized, not just to one child, but to the entire school community's understanding of who deserved inclusion and celebration. Giuseppe deflected the thanks as gracefully as he could, uncomfortable with praise for what felt like bare minimum human decency. But Principal Russo persisted with an invitation to the school's end-of-year celebration, where students performed for parents. "Noah specifically asked if you might come," she said with careful emphasis on the child's request rather than the school's desire. "She's been talking all week about her friend who danced with her and wondering if she might see you again." The word friend lodged in Giuseppe's chest like something sharp and warm simultaneously. This child who'd known him for one evening, considering him worthy of that title. and he found himself agreeing to attend before his rational mind could catalog all the reasons why maintaining this connection was complicated. Principal Russo's relief was audible, her thanks effusive in a way that suggested she'd expected rejection, and Giuseppe ended the call wondering what exactly he'd committed himself to beyond another school event. His daughter called that evening for their Sunday conversation, but on Friday instead, a deviation from established pattern that Giuseppe interpreted as progress toward something less rigid and obligatory, and he told her about the invitation. "That's beautiful," she said with genuine warmth that had been absent from her voice for years. "This little girl is adopting you whether you're ready or not, and maybe that's exactly what you need. Someone whose expectations are simple enough that you can actually meet them." The observation carried truth that made Giuseppe uncomfortable. The implication that he'd failed his daughter because the bar was too high while succeeding with Noah because her needs were more basic. But his daughter didn't seem to mean it as criticism. She was simply acknowledging reality, that sometimes people needed practice at simple presence before they could manage complex presence, that rebuilding had to start somewhere even if that somewhere wasn't the most important relationship requiring repair. Saturday morning, Giuseppe did something he hadn't done since his own daughter's childhood. Going to a toy store and browsing the aisles trying to determine what a 5-year-old girl might want that wasn't condescending or inappropriate. He settled finally on a book about brave girls throughout history, thinking that Noah had demonstrated the kind of courage the book celebrated, and had it wrapped with more care than he'd given to any business gift in memory. The weekend passed in this strange new rhythm of normal business interspersed with moments of connection, calls with his daughter that were growing more substantial, and thoughts of Noah that interrupted his usual single-minded focus on empire maintenance. His associates noticed without commenting directly, their awareness showing in subtle shifts in how they approached him, slightly less afraid and slightly more human, as if his own emerging humanity gave them permission for the same. Monday brought news that a rival organization was testing boundaries in a neighborhood Giuseppe had controlled for a decade, the kind of challenge that would normally demand immediate and overwhelming response to maintain respect. But instead of the usual calculated violence, Giuseppe chose a meeting, a negotiation, a solution that didn't require anyone to bleed, and the decision surprised everyone, including himself, because he was operating from a different calculus than pure power dynamics. The negotiation succeeded through combination of Giuseppe's reputation and his unexpected willingness to find accommodation rather than crush opposition, and afterward his second-in-command asked directly what had changed. Giuseppe's answer was simple and inadequate, that he'd been reminded lately that force wasn't the only form of strength, that sometimes presence mattered more than dominance, and his lieutenant nodded slowly, as if this cryptic response made more sense than it should. Wednesday evening arrived with the school's end-of-year celebration scheduled for 6 o'clock, and Giuseppe prepared with the same careful attention he'd given to the dance, choosing clothes that were nice but not intimidating, arriving slightly early but not so early as to seem overeager. The school gymnasium was decorated again, but this time with student artwork and handmade banners celebrating the academic year, a different atmosphere than the father-daughter dance but carrying similar weight of community gathering and childhood celebration. Noah saw him enter, and her face transformed into pure joy, that unguarded happiness children show before they learn to moderate their emotional displays, and she ran across the gymnasium in her school uniform to grab his hand. She introduced him to her teacher with pride that seemed disconnected from any understanding of who he actually was, just presenting him as her friend Giuseppe, who danced with her at the special event, and the teacher greeted him with warmth that suggested she'd heard this story multiple times. The performance was predictably chaotic, 5- and 6-year-olds singing slightly off-key and forgetting their places in choreographed movements. But Giuseppe watched with the same attention he'd give important business presentations, because Noah was in the third row, gesturing enthusiastically. His daughter had texted him earlier asking him to take a video if possible, wanting to see what had captured her father's attention so completely, and he recorded the entire performance with hands steadier than they'd been signing contracts worth millions. Afterward, Noah brought him to meet her grandmother, who'd made the difficult journey to school despite her health challenges, and the old woman embraced Giuseppe with strength that belied her frail appearance. "You've given her something precious," she whispered in his ear while Noah was distracted showing her classmate the book Giuseppe had brought, the knowledge that she's worth showing up for, and that's a gift that will carry her through whatever difficulties life brings next. Giuseppe left the school celebration with Noah's artwork carefully rolled in his hand, a crayon drawing of 2 figures dancing that she'd made specifically for him to remember their evening together, and he understood that he was being incorporated into this child's life in ways that required reciprocal commitment. He couldn't be the adult who showed up twice, then disappeared, couldn't give her hope of consistent connection, then withdraw into his usual isolation, and the responsibility felt heavier than any business obligation he'd ever carried. His daughter called that night wanting to hear about the performance, and Giuseppe described it with detail that surprised them both. His ability to recall specific moments from a children's show evidence of attention he'd rarely given anything outside his empire. She asked to see the video, and he sent it immediately, then waited while she watched, hearing her quiet laughter through the phone at the children's enthusiastic imprecision, and something in that shared moment felt like progress toward the relationship they'd both lost years ago. "I'm thinking of coming to Naples next month," his daughter said with studied casualness that didn't quite hide the significance of the offer. "Maybe staying for a long weekend if you'd have time to actually spend together. Not just dinner between your business meetings, but actual time where you're present." The proposal terrified and thrilled Giuseppe in equal measure. The prospect of extended proximity after years of careful distance, the risk that he'd revert to old patterns under the pressure of sustained contact. He agreed without hedging or adding qualifications about his schedule, committing to clearing whatever needed clearing to make space for her visit, and his daughter's quiet thank you carried weight that made his throat tight. They talked for another hour about logistics and plans, what she'd want to see in Naples and whether she'd stay at his apartment or prefer a hotel. Negotiations that felt simultaneously mundane and monumentally important because they were building structure for connection that might actually hold. The following Tuesday morning, Giuseppe's Mercedes slowed at Via Toledo corner, not because Noah was waiting, but because he'd asked his driver to pause there, wanting to mark the spot where his life had changed, even if the change was still fragile and incomplete. A month had passed since that first encounter, 4 weeks of phone calls with his daughter, and occasional visits to Noah's school events, small consistent presences that were starting to accumulate into something that might become actual relationship. His second-in-command had stopped questioning the boss's new patterns, accepting that Giuseppe was somehow managing to maintain his empire while also attending children's performances and having lengthy phone conversations with his daughter in Milan. The organization adapted because it had to, finding that their leader's slight softening didn't actually diminish his effectiveness and might even improve certain negotiations where empathy served better than pure intimidation. Noah's grandmother's health had declined slightly over the month, her diabetes requiring more careful management, and her eyesight continuing to fail despite new glasses. And Giuseppe had quietly arranged for better medical care, without making it obvious enough to insult her dignity. The old woman knew, of course. No one moved through Quartieri Spagnoli without people noticing. But she accepted the help with grace that suggested she understood he needed to give it as much as she needed to receive it. The spring semester ended with another school celebration, and Giuseppe attended alongside parents who were growing accustomed to his presence. Conversations with other fathers, becoming slightly less awkward as they found common ground in the shared experience of watching children perform. He was still Giuseppe, still commanded respect and fear in the streets outside the school, but inside this building he was increasingly just another adult who showed up for children who needed showing up for. His daughter's visit was scheduled for the third weekend in June, and Giuseppe prepared his apartment with an attention to detail that would have amused his associates if they'd witnessed it, buying flowers and stocking her favorite foods from childhood, and generally trying to create space that would welcome, rather than intimidate. He was terrified she'd arrive, and find nothing had really changed, that his recent efforts were performative rather than genuine, that the gap between them remained unbridgeable, despite phone calls and good intentions. She arrived on Friday evening, her embrace at the airport tentative but real, and Giuseppe felt years of distance compress into the physical space between them that was simultaneously too much and not enough. They drove through Naples together with her pointing out changes since her last visit, and him providing updates on family haunts and neighborhood evolution, conversation that was easier than he'd expected, because it focused on external things rather than the complicated internal landscape they were trying to navigate. Dinner that first night was at a restaurant Giuseppe had chosen carefully. Nice, but not ostentatious. Public enough to prevent either of them from breaking down, but intimate enough for real conversation. And they talked for 3 hours about everything they'd missed in 13 years of distance. His daughter cried twice, and Giuseppe cried once, all of them quickly dabbing tears while pretending this was normal dinner conversation. And by the time they left the restaurant, something had shifted between them toward genuine rather than obligatory connection. Saturday, he took her to meet Noah, wanting his daughter to see the child who'd somehow catalyzed his transformation, and the meeting was awkward and beautiful in equal measure. Noah was shy initially around this elegant woman from Milan, But Giuseppe's daughter had brought a gift, a bracelet she'd designed herself at her firm, and the gesture opened conversation between them. They talked about dancing and school and brave girls throughout history, and Giuseppe watched the two most important females in his life connect over shared experience of loving someone who was learning to love better. His daughter pulled him aside while Noah was showing her grandmother the bracelet, and said quietly that she could see why this child had gotten through his defenses, that there was something about her direct honesty that made pretense impossible, and maybe that's what he'd needed all along. Giuseppe nodded, unable to articulate that Noah had reminded him what his daughter had been like before he'd taught her through absence, that caring too much meant getting hurt too often, and that memory had finally given him motivation to try doing better. Sunday morning, they attended Mass together, Giuseppe and his daughter sitting in his family's pew, the way they had when she was small, and the familiar ritual in unfamiliar company created bridge between past and present that felt both painful and healing. Afterward, they walked through markets where Giuseppe had walked the previous month, vendors greeting him with slightly more warmth now that he appeared with family, evidence that even feared men could have daughters who loved them enough to visit. The weekend ended with genuine sadness at parting rather than relief at separation, his daughter's embrace at the airport lasting longer than the arrival embrace, her promise to call on Tuesday rather than waiting for Sunday feeling significant. She thanked him for the visit and for trying, and Giuseppe thanked her for giving him another chance despite every reason not to, and they separated with understanding that this was beginning rather than ending, that difficult work still lay ahead, but they were both committed to doing it. Monday morning, Giuseppe returned to his usual business routines, but they felt different now, infused with awareness that his empire wasn't the totality of his life, that he had daughter in Milan, and small friend in Quartieri Spagnoli, and relationships that required tending regardless of territorial disputes or financial opportunities. His second-in-command noticed the shift and asked if the visit had gone well, and Giuseppe's smile was answer enough, the kind of genuine happiness that had been absent from his face so long people had forgotten he possessed the capacity. Noah's end-of-year report card arrived with marks that were good but not exceptional, the kind of academic performance that suggested a child who was learning despite carrying grief that would have crushed many adults. And Giuseppe felt proud in ways that surprised him. Her teacher had added a note mentioning that Noah had shown remarkable growth in confidence and social engagement since the father-daughter dance, that having someone reliable show up for her had created foundation for taking risks in other areas of life. The note made Giuseppe think about reliability and showing up and all the ways he'd failed those basic requirements with his own daughter, but also about the possibility of doing better going forward, of being the person who could be counted on, rather than the person who consistently disappointed. It wasn't redemption exactly. Nothing could redeem years of absence and neglect, but it was perhaps the beginning of living differently than he had for the previous 2 decades. Summer arrived in Naples with heat that drove everyone to seek shade and gelato, and Giuseppe found himself incorporating regular visits to Noah and her grandmother into his weekly schedule the same way he scheduled business meetings and territory reviews. They weren't long visits, usually just an hour on Wednesday afternoons, but they were consistent in ways that mattered more than duration, proving that he could be reliable when he chose to prioritize someone other than himself. His daughter called not just on Sundays now, but scattered throughout the week, short conversations about small things that were building toward comfort with each other's presence in daily life rather than just obligatory check-ins. She was planning another visit for August and mentioned maybe staying longer this time, possibly a full week if he could actually commit to being available. And Giuseppe agreed, knowing that each promise he made was both gift and test of his capacity for sustained change. The summer heat transformed Naples into something slower and more languorous, business continuing but at a pace that accommodated seeking shade and long lunches that stretched into early evening, and Giuseppe found himself appreciating these seasonal rhythms in ways his previous relentless focus on efficiency had never permitted. His organization noticed that their boss took Wednesday afternoons as essentially sacred, unavailable for meetings or crisis management during the hours he spent with Noah and her grandmother, and the pattern became so established that people stopped even trying to schedule around it. Some associates grumbled privately about his shifting priorities, but others recognized that Giuseppe remained as effective as ever in matters that actually required his attention, just more selective about what qualified as genuinely urgent versus what people had labeled urgent, because they'd grown accustomed to his constant availability. The neighborhood where Noah lived began treating Giuseppe differently as summer progressed, not with less fear exactly, but with a kind of complicated respect that acknowledged he could be dangerous and kind simultaneously, that human beings contained multitudes that didn't resolve into simple categories. Vendors in the market greeted him by name and asked after the little girl everyone knew had somehow claimed him, and Giuseppe found himself engaged in conversations about children and family that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, when his public persona permitted no softness that could be interpreted as weakness. He understood he was being absorbed into the community in a way that was separate from his role as feared power broker, that his Wednesday visits and school attendance had created an identity that coexisted with his reputation rather than replacing it, and the duality felt sustainable in ways purely performing one role or the other never had. The man who'd been approached by a 5-year-old orphan on a Tuesday morning in spring found himself by summer transformed in ways both subtle and profound, still dangerous when necessary, but also capable of tenderness he'd thought was permanently buried with his father. He wasn't redeemed, and he wasn't reformed entirely, still ran his empire with efficiency that required moral compromises, but he was present for 2 people who needed him in ways that made everything else feel slightly less important than it had before. Noah's grandmother told him one Wednesday afternoon that he'd given her granddaughter something money couldn't buy, the knowledge that she was worth showing up for, and Giuseppe understood she was talking about more than just the dance. Every Wednesday visit, every school event he attended, every small, consistent presence was telling this child that her life mattered to someone beyond her failing grandmother, that she had value independent of her orphan status, and that knowledge would carry her through whatever difficulties adolescence and adulthood brought. The story that had begun with impossible request on a street corner became neighborhood legend, retold in cafes and markets with slight variations but essential truth intact, about the day the feared Mafia Boss's heart broke open for a child brave enough to ask for what she needed. People debated what it meant about Giuseppe's character, whether kindness to one orphan balanced cruelty in business, whether any amount of good deeds could redeem a life built on morally questionable foundations. But these philosophical questions mattered less than the practical reality that 2 people had found connection when they'd both been drowning in different forms of loneliness. Giuseppe himself stopped trying to analyze what it all meant, stopped questioning whether his motivations were pure or whether he deserved credit for basic human decency, and simply committed to showing up for the people who needed him to show up. He'd missed 18 years with his daughter, and he'd never get those back, but he had today, and tomorrow, and however many days remained if he could avoid reverting to old patterns of prioritizing empire over relationship. Thank you all for following this story. If it touched your heart, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing you these moments of unexpected kindness, because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for what we need, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply show up when someone asks.